All right, hello and welcome everyone. So today we're going to be talking about multi-group and within subject research design. I'll be honest and say that this is, at least for me, one of the more dense chapters of the book, but it will hopefully have been building up to this point, so it shouldn't shock you too much. Last week, what we talked about were experimental designs more broadly and two-group designs. And as a reminder, a big part of why we use experimental designs in general, but we're going to hone in on psychology and behavioral sciences, is because it helps us test the cause and effect of relationships. If we want to be able to say that this variable impacts this other one in a certain way, there's a lot of design that goes into that to be able to confidently say that. We also want to think about controlling for confounds. And again, those are variables that might actually impact your dependent variable that you aren't measuring for. We want to be able to isolate variables as much as possible. And then lastly, the quality of the design very much affects the validity of your conclusions. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong in an experimental design before you even really start thinking about your specific research question. It's a lot of the design component of it, and it's often one of the more challenging parts of research is this design piece of it. So I find that the easiest way to do this is to go through some of the common threats for validity and then talk through what those um, different types of experiments are and tell you which ones are more threats. So we'll do it this way. Threats and validity. So as a reminder, internal validity is how confident we are that we can say that our independent variable, or the thing that we change, is what is causing the observed change in the dependent variable, or the outcome of what we're really studying. There are quite a few general threats to internal validity within experiments and experimental design. And I really pick the ones that are going to be the most universal here. They're actually usually called universal threats or classic threats to internal validity for experimental designs. And when we're working with people, it is already complicated enough. So I'll just kind of start at the top. The very first one is maturity. So people, whether they're participating in research or not, they're going to change and grow naturally over time. So this can be stuff like aging, it can be fatigue, it can be recovery. One of the fundamental concerns you have to account for in experimental design with humans is that time will continue. So we try to keep our subject, in this case a person, as similar as possible, but you have to think about things like maturation. So if I'm studying something like cognitive development, for example, I have to account for if I test at age 2 and then age 6, that change over time, that natural maturation is going to change not only the cognitive development that I might be using as my dependent variable, but it's also going to change what measures are most appropriate at any given time. It's going to change the questions. It's going to change the way you interact with the participant. That maturation is a very considerable part of experimental design when you're talking about anything living. And for us, that's everything in psychology. We're most interested in people. Um, Attrition is a fancy way of saying you lose participants. So attrition, it's sometimes also called mortality, but that is depressing, so I prefer the word attrition. It means that participants drop out of a study. So this can be a really big problem. Actually, this is very commonly a very big problem. You have a great research design, you spend all this time recruiting people, but you lose half of them throughout the time. The longer the study is, the greater the risk of attrition is. So if I'm doing something longitudinal, which means I'm following people across time periods to look at a change, you always have to account for attrition. You usually want to have more participants than you need because you know you're going to lose some of them. Some of this might just be because people don't want to do it anymore. They're disinterested. Some of it might be that maybe they thought that they were going to get maybe they thought they were going to get the independent variable, some new treatment, some new something in their life, but they didn't. Maybe they got the control group, so they quit. Sometimes people die. Sometimes people are no longer qualified to be in the study because something else changes in their life over time. There's a whole lot of reason why someone might drop out. And you have to account for that. It's especially big problem within psychological and behavioral sciences. And I'm going to pick on medical studies just because it tends to be easiest. If I'm doing a huge medical study about cancer research, and I have two groups, just for simplicity of conversation here. One of them is a control group, meaning they don't get the new experimental treatment, and the other group does get the experimental treatment. If I have a bunch of people in my control group quit and attrition out, I can't use the control group for its intended design if I lose too many people, because you have to meet a minimum amount of participants to do that. You also run the risk of people dying. And then it's like, okay, well, did people die because they were not receiving this treatment? Did people die in a car accident? Like, you have to start accounting for all of those things. And that also goes into not only the design, but also some of the legal elements of it, so that people would be able to release information for you for why someone isn't coming back. So for example, if I'm doing that cancer treatment design, part of the design itself is going to be accounting for attrition. Not only am I going to have more participants than I actually need, but I'm also going to make sure that within my informed consent waiver, I have the right to reach out to a next of kin or a contact person to be able to ask them, hey, why did this person not come back? Because sometimes they'll just no show, sometimes they'll just ghost. And it might be important data if they leave or attrition out for a certain reason. So lots of different things can go wrong that are going to make people stop coming. And you have to think about that when you think about research design. How can we incentivize people to stay in the study as much as possible? And how can we design it so that if we do have a lot of attrition, it doesn't totally ruin the entire experiment? History, that's a big one. It turns out you don't have control over the overall state of the world. By history, I don't just mean things that literally happened in the past. History in this context means broader social happenings. So this is some sort of external event that might occur during the study that can impact participants' behaviors or outcome. So this can be stuff like what's happening in the news. It can be cultural stressors. It can be lots of different things. I mean, goodness. For example, I have a friend right now who is doing research on how people of different marginalized groups experience stress and how that impacts their long-term health outcomes. And in the middle of her study, we've had all these changes in conversations around social justice and around DEI. And so while she started the study at a totally different cultural moment, now it's a big topic in the news, and it is necessarily in front of people a lot more. So you're having all these elevated layers of stress, but it's hard to know if that was there pre or post this particular political time. So when she tries to then understand her data, she's going to have to think about the context of history, and it's going to fundamentally change how she interprets those results. Another example like this might be, let's say you are studying something about how children develop socially in school. Like maybe you're doing some sort of experiment in a classroom technique, and you had a 5-year longitudinal design where you were going to be tracking people from 2018 all the way to 2023. Well, think about what in history might have impacted education from 2018 to 2023. COVID. If that did not immediately come to mind, it should, right? The world shook up at that time, and education is one of the things that was most directly impacted by that. So if I was doing this longitudinal design, it took me 4 years to design the thing and get research funding and get my team together and make everything is in place and make sure I have my measures and make sure I account for this, that, and the other thing. I start collecting data, and then COVID hits. And it totally changes the context of your experiment. That's a really big problem. So history, what is happening in the world more broadly, can very much be a threat to internal validity. And there's different things you can do about it. It, of course, depends on the context, but more often than not, it means that the way you interpret your results are going to have to change to adapt for that history. We also have something called testing effects. Testing effects is when the participant is exposed to the same test or task that you are using to measure whatever it is you're measuring, but because they are repeatedly exposed to it, they have influence on their performance because they're using that same test over and over again. It can make them more familiar with it in a way that's going to make them test more highly than they actually like than their abilities actually reflect. It could make them more sensitive to it. There's lots of different ways that can go wrong. A good example of something like this is let's say I am doing an experiment and I am trying to see how caffeine impacts someone's cognitive abilities. And I find this great measure of cognitive ability, but I give them caffeine, I give them that same cognitive test. A day later, they come in, they take a different level of caffeine, but they take the same cognitive test. Well, now they took the test yesterday too, so they've had more time to think about those answers. They could have gone home and Googled something, they could have practiced it. Practice in and of itself will make you better at a task. You have to think about that sort of thing, how long it is between the tasks you're asking them to retake. I'll go on about this in a little bit later as well. But testing effects are a really big consideration, especially within psychology, when we're so often using these standardized measures for some sort of cognitive or behavioral functioning. We have to be able to think, okay, are people learning how to take the test? And is that unfairly changing their results or not? I'll talk more about that though. All right, so we have a few more general threats to internal validity. So this top one is instrumentation. So this is changes to the measurement tool, procedure, or observed behavior over time that affects how the dependent variable is recorded. So an example here is the rater might be more lenient over time. Maybe I have a researcher who is coming in and watching children perform some sort of play task, and we're doing some sort of research around play. And it's their job to observe the children and rate them on certain things. But on Monday, when they come in, they're in a really good mood. They're feeling a little more generous. Yeah, maybe that kid is doing really well. Maybe I'm going to err on the side of positivity. But then they get in a fight with their own kid and they come back on Friday and they're in a bad mood and then they're rating things a little bit more negatively. And it's not actually the data that's changing, it's the observation of the data that's changing. That's a really considerable part of this. But it's not always reasonable to have self-report. Again, we just talked about the learning the test problem. So lots of different things that could be happening. Also, sometimes if it's a longitudinal study over a really long period of time, things might have been updated. So if I'm doing some sort of study around cognitive ability, let's say I'm using a standard IQ test, and the first time I test people, they're 5. When I test them again when they're 10, I use the same version of that cognitive assessment. But when I test them when they're 20, that assessment has been updated. So then you have to make a choice. Do I use the more updated assessment that we know is more accurate, or do I have to keep using that same measure because that's what I did at the other time points? The answer is you have to use the same measure at the other time points. I mean, it gets more complicated than that, but you see what I mean? So it's not just the instrument itself can change over time, which it can, and that's a problem. It's also the way you're recording it, especially in psychology, things like observations. Or if you are verbally asking your participant questions, the way you ask the question, the tone, the influx, the person who's asking it, maybe you have 3 researchers and one of them is really kind and warm and people feel more comfortable talking to them, and one of them is kind of cold and withdrawn and people feel uncomfortable talking to them. And the third one is kind of all over the place in the middle and sort of goofy and distracted, and so they kind of get inconsistent results. All of those types of things. Remember the conversation we had earlier in class about how important it is to standardize your procedure so that you can control as much as possible, so you can more confidently say, it's this change that makes this impact or this outcome, the cause and effect. Instrumentation can be a very big consideration in that. We also have this problem called regression to the mean. This is when a participant is extremely high or extremely low scoring on a first measurement, and then they will pretty consistently have that same average over time. I'm actually going to show a little bit of a video of this because it can be kind of complicated.
A basketball coach tells his statistician friend how confused he is because it almost always seems that one, whenever he congratulates a player after great performance, he does worse next time. Two, whenever he angrily criticizes a player after a poor performance, he does better next time. Does this mean he should stop congratulating players and only criticize them? The statistician laughs and tells him no, not really. In fact, the coach is describing the so-called regression to the mean, which is just a fancy way of saying that things even out over time whenever there's luck involved, or chance, randomness, whatever you choose to call it. You see, in many cases, basketball games included, luck plays an important role. Sometimes you get lucky and play better than normal. Other times, bad luck makes you perform worse than usual. In both cases, you tend to move back to your mean, or if you will, average performance. He then tells the coach, one, a player who performed remarkably better than usual was probably having a lucky day, and whether you congratulate him or not, he's likely to revert to his average performance after that. Two, a player you criticized because he did worse than usual probably had an unlucky day, and whether you criticize him or not, is likely to do better next time, climbing back to his average performance. Make sense?
Okay, so I like that example because it shows how a bad design can give you false results. If my design was a cross-sectional, meaning one time, I'm not tracking something over time, I'm just taking a snapshot of that one time, and I'm looking at whether or not a coach giving positive feedback impacts players' performance. And I'm not accounting for this regression to the mean. If I just look at one snapshot, even use the example of the video of that one day, the coach congratulated someone who was doing well and gave feedback to someone who was doing not well. Because I'm only collecting that information once, I'm not actually getting a wrong metric of that player's true average. So what you would want to do to avoid the problem of regression to the mean is you need to collect that information several times so that you can determine a true average or a true mean and then compare those means between your groups. So if I wanted to do this, where I wanted to test if coach feedback actually impacts players' outcomes, first I would take, and I'm making numbers up here. I have no idea. Y'all are welcome to correct me in the comments. But let's say a basketball team has 40 people on it. The first thing I would do is for the first 6 months, I would track each individual player in terms of their statistics and hoop shot or whatever it is. And I would do nothing different. I would not edit anything at all. I would want their actual normal average of performance without asking the coach to change anything. Then, after maybe a few months of that, collecting that baseline data, I'm going to divide them into one half is a control group where I don't have the coach do anything different than normal. And the other half, I'm going to have the coach specifically praise them and give them compliments or encouragement, uh, whatever that independent variable is that I'm thinking might make a difference in the dependent variable, which in this case is their performance. So then we'll track that for the next 6 months, so however many games that is, because we want to have a true average, which means I have to collect it several times before the intervention. And we want to have a true average after the intervention. One time isn't enough because there's things like luck that's going to edit what our actual overall average performance is. The comparison group or that control group would be helpful within the experimental part of the design because I'm continuing to collect those means and it'll be a cleaner comparison point to the half of the team that is getting the treatment, which in this case is that praise or encouragement. So regression to the mean. It is especially important when you are considering something that might, if you're trying to measure something that has a luck component to it or a chance component to it or whatever you want to call that, it's even more important that you are considering collecting information several times to help mitigate or lessen the impact of the regression to the mean problem. We also have something, and I don't have this listed, but it's called a ceiling effect, which essentially means that I'm trying to measure change over time, but I have a sample that is already at the high end of my measure. So let's say I'm trying to test how teacher feedback on essays impacts grades, but my participants are already getting high A's on everything. So with the additional feedback, they're still getting high A's. So if you just look at the number, there actually isn't very much change. But we can't actually say that the feedback didn't matter because we're having the ceiling effect of, well, we can't really measure change because they're already at that upper level of performance. So there's nowhere else to go. There's nowhere higher to go. So I did not include that one because it's a little more advanced, but it's not dissimilar from the regression to the mean. It's looking at your overall picture of data and what it how you are able to reasonably interpret it. And it's a huge part of research design with people because I don't know if y'all know this, but a lot of life is luck and chance. A lot of it is just out of specific control. So you got to make sure that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring and that you're actually getting a good snapshot of that thing. Regression to the mean. And then we also have this issue of selection bias. I have gone on about this pretty considerably earlier in the course, so I won't re-hit it too hard, but the short of it is that pre-existing differences in your participants before the experiment can really impact your validity and how accurate your results are. So it's part of, in earlier lessons, I think 2 other lessons, we talked about the importance of participant sampling and making sure that the differences in your groups are even. So if, let's say, well, the example I have here is one group has older participants or a higher baseline of motivation because participants self-selected and were assigned non-randomly. So let's say I am doing an experiment on the cognitive effects of caffeine, and instead of randomly assigning my participants, I let them pick, okay, does it make more sense for you to come in on Monday or does it make more sense for you to come in on Wednesday? But everyone who comes in on Monday are people who are um, librarians, because let's say in our make-believe world, libraries are closed. I don't know, it's getting away from me. Whatever. If I let people select to come in, let's change it. Let's back that up. Let's say I'm doing a experiment with the effects of caffeine and cognitive performance, and they have the option to either come in on a Sunday or to come in on a Wednesday. By natural self-selection, I'm going to have people who work during the week. They're going to be much more likely to come in on Sunday. It also means that it's a Sunday, so they won't have as much work. And what that means in terms of a selection bias is that they might be more likely to have already had caffeine. It might also mean that they're more likely to have slept better the night before because they didn't have to wake up that morning for work. It would also be a sample bias on the Wednesday, right? Because it might be people who don't work during the week. So they might be a slightly older crowd if there's more people who are retired, for example, or it might be more people with different types of disabilities, or it might be people who work non-traditional jobs at weird hours who are able to do that. And that might impact their sleep, which would impact their relationship to caffeine. So there's lots of different variables that would go into that, which is why when we want to randomly assign those groups to control for some of that natural variance. It depends on the research question. I know I've talked about this already, but the short of it is selection bias and the participants themselves and who are in which group is incredibly important to consider when you're trying to think through internal validity and making sure your research design is strong. We want to make sure that we keep things as consistent as possible between groups. There's always going to be risk when you're working with people. There's always going to be variation in people's, not only their like genetic makeup, but also their day-to-day experiences, their behaviors, their thoughts, their feelings, how closely they adhere to things, all those different components. So these are all threats to internal validity for pretty much any type of experiment that someone's going to be doing with humans.
A basketball code.
So these are, this is something I took directly out of your textbook. I like it because it gives us a nice little way to look at all of the different types of threats, what they are, and then possible solutions. This will be helpful as you think through your own research design as part of our proposal project. One of the things you'll do this week is think about potential threats and how you might solve that problem, or at least try to lessen that problem. Here's some good ideas. I also came up with my own because I am a nerd and did, and I personally find this really helpful. Again, this is each of the threats we've talked about, the description, and it's also going to tell you which type of design is at most risk for that particular issue. I'm going to talk through what these designs are the rest of the class, but this will be really helpful as you're thinking through your own project, because you're thinking simultaneously about, okay, which design is going to make the most sense and what are the soft spots or things I need to think about within that design. So this graph will be really helpful when you come to that point. We also have some design-specific threats to internal validity. So I will talk about this again here in a minute when I talk about the different types of design, but I want to explain what it is before I then talk about the certain application to design. So the big design-specific threat to internal validity within experiments in this context are called order effects. Order effects are a way to refer to changes in participant performance that are caused by the sequence of the conditions as they are experienced rather than the conditions themselves. Another way of saying this is the order in which you have your participants do that experiment or engage with your different conditions matters. There are a lot of different types of order effects, but the three big ones are called practice, fatigue, and carryover. Practice effects is kind of what we talked about earlier. This is when someone's performance improves over time because they've learned or are now more familiar with that task. So the example I was using earlier is cognitive testing. If you give someone the same cognitive test repeatedly, they will naturally learn how to take the test. They will have more time in between to reflect. You won't get that same initial cognitive solving ability or not. I mean, it's just like any other test. I'm sure you've taken tests repeatedly before. You notice that they get more, they get easier the more you take them because now you know what the test is like. And if you let them leave and go home, a lot of them are going to look up the correct answers or their practice. There's lots of different things that can go wrong. And it means that their results might show improvement, but it's not actually because of your manipulated variable. It's because they've learned how to take the test. And that's really bad. And it can lead to false conclusions. On the other side of that is you could have a fatigue effect. And so this is where performance declines over time because they're tired or they're bored. And it's not actually the manipulated variable that's doing that. It's the way you're asking them to engage with it. So let's say I'm doing cognitive tests, but they have to stay all day. It's over one weekend that I do all these different experiments with someone, and then I keep having them do cognitive tests. Even if I change the cognitive test, a different type of test, so that I can avoid those practice effects, but now I'm asking them to do hours worth of cognitive assessment. I'll tell you, as someone who does cognitive assessment, even when someone's paying you to do cognitive assessment, by hour 4, people care less. People are tired. People are not going to put as much cognitive effort into something because I'm sick of this. I don't want to do it anymore. And that might falsely show in the data that someone is getting worse over time, and you might falsely attribute that to your manipulated variable rather than they're tired and they're not wanting to participate in the data collection portion of it anymore. There's lots of reasons that might happen. So thinking about how long a survey is, thinking about how long the test is, thinking about how often you're asking someone to do something. So another example of something like this is if I am asking someone to have a journal every single day so that I, as a researcher, can look at changes over time. But the journal takes someone an hour to do every day. I'm here to tell you that for the first week or so, people will be real motivated. They'll do the journal real great. And then after about a week, just by human nature, we lose focus on those things. And so the journals become shorter. They become less detailed. They become less rich data. So it's like a balance of, okay, I need this information, but if I ask them to do something too many times, they're not going to keep doing it. Or we're going to have this fatigue effect where their performance will decline, but it might not actually be because of the thing I'm manipulating. And then we also have carryover effects. This is where the effect of one condition lingers or influences the performance in the next condition. So this is a particularly big problem with drug effects or emotional states. If I'm going to be using an example on the next few slides about caffeine. So let's talk about that. If I'm doing an experiment about different levels of caffeine and their impact on cognitive performance, if I'm using the same participant and in the morning I give them 100 milligrams of caffeine and then test them, and then in the afternoon I give them 200 milligrams of caffeine and then test them, the 100 milligrams from that morning aren't totally out of their system yet. So it's a carryover. They're not actually coming in at a baseline. It's the same thing if I'm trying to test the impact of even like a depression medicine. If I have someone take a certain level of that depression medicine, let's say 150 milligrams of Wellbutrin for 6 months, and I test them, I say, okay, here's the impact, and then I bump them up to 250. I don't know if that change is because they already had the 150 in their system and the bump to 200 is what made the difference, or if it's actually something unique about that 200 level because they would be additive over time. It's especially a problem with any sort of emotional state that you're trying to track. Yeah, big problem in medicine in general, honestly. And it's part of where we love control groups. I'll talk about some ways to handle some of this in a minute. These particular threats are really impactful because they have a very high potential to have confounding results. So you might mistakenly attribute that change to something that isn't your independent variable. These threats are specifically important when you're looking at any sort of within subject or mixed design, but I'll come back to that here in just a second. So these are these design specific ones. They're called order effects. There's a few standard ways to try to control for this. So the first way to control for an order effect is something called counterbalancing. Counterbalancing is when we vary the order of conditions across participants. So people get each treatment form in random ways. So I'm not giving everyone the same treatment in the same order. I'm randomly assigning them to different treatment orders to try to balance out some of those effects. Um, so it can get really complicated. It's at a higher level of course design than what we're currently doing. I just want to expose you to it. I'm not going to make you do Latin square designs. You can see some examples of them in your textbook, or counterbalancing designs and what that looks like. But the short of it is that we're going to vary the order of conditions across participants. The idea being that you're while yes, you're still going to have some order effects with individuals because we're looking this at aggregate, when you balance it different ways for different people, overall, you'll have a more accurate data collection of the full group because we're counterbalancing it. We're averaging it out. We're like, yes, we know this is an impact, but because we did it differently for different people, it will balance out in the end. Randomization, we've talked about quite a bit already. I want to stress home again how random assignment to different groups are very important, and random assignment to the different conditions are also very important. The more randomly we can spread out participants, the less of a chance that there's going to be a particular participant bias in any of your conditions. It helps distribute the order more unpredictably across the sample in a way that from a statistical side will balance out and give you a more accurate representation of the impact on the whole rather than the impact on the individual. We also have something called washout periods. This is when we have a break or a delay between conditions so that people can uh, like if we're using the caffeine example, I'm definitely going to use a washout period because I want that caffeine to totally exit their system. This is really helpful for anything involving drugs, anything involving mood, anything involving physiological changes. So for example, maybe I'm looking at the impact of exercise on mood, and I have someone come in the morning and I have them run a mile while I test their physiological heart rate and whatever, and then we give them a mood test. I'm not going to give them an hour off and then have them come back and do the next experiment, I'm probably going to give them at least a day because I want their whole body to physiologically reset along with their mood. Depends on what you're testing, how long that washout period might need to be, but you want to err on the side of caution because we're trying to avoid that carryover. And then we also have practice trials. So these are not always going to be the best approach, but sometimes they're really helpful. And this is where we have a training phase before we actually start the experimental condition. So let's say I am looking at some sort of uh, performance. Let's say I'm looking at how different levels of caffeine help, or like how different levels of caffeine impact someone's reaction time while driving. And the way I'm testing that is I'm having people ingest different levels of caffeine and then I'm putting them in a car simulator and I'm having different things come up and then I test how quickly they react to those different stimuli while they're in their little fake car. One of the things that'll happen is when you put someone in that fake car to begin with, there's going to be a learning curve where they're getting familiar with the buttons, they're getting familiar with how it feels, they're adjusting to it being weird in the simulator, whatever that is. So I wouldn't want to use their first time ever as their baseline reaction time. I'm going to let them practice that a couple of times before I start testing for real their experience. I'm letting them learn enough to get familiar with the task so that I'm not having all this false garbage data when they're just learning how to do the thing. Now that depends. It depends on the research. It depends on the question, but sometimes it can be really helpful if you know there's going to be that learning curve that will make your data look like someone's worse at something than they actually are, because after they've tried it a couple of times, you'll get a more accurate representation of their actual abilities. And then you can start messing with caffeine and see if it changes things. Yeah. Okay, so I will also note that it is a good idea to do several of these things. It depends on the design, it depends on the high stakes of it. We'll talk about some of those nuances and when you might want to use what, but a very common combination is something like counterbalancing plus washout period. It just depends, but you can use multiple of these controls to try to lessen the impact of order effects or to increase overall validity. Similarly, I love a chart. It makes it a lot easier for me, at least, to kind of consolidate all of this information. So these are just the order effects and the definition of them, and then how you might prevent that. So as you are designing your own experiment, this will be a really helpful chart for you to come back and look at. Okay, so building. Two are major types of experimental design. Last week, we talked about two-group design, and now we're going to talk about different multiple level group designs, multi-group designs. So first we have between subject multi-group designs. Between subject experimental designs is when a participant is assigned to only one condition or one level of the independent variable. Groups are compared to assess the effect of that independent variable, and these are called a lot of different things. So sometimes between subjects, I don't like really know why. Sometimes they're called between group rather than between subjects. Sometimes they're called independent group design. Sometimes they're called independent measures design. They're all talking about the exact same thing. It is the same condition where it's at its core, it's an experimental design where participants are only consigned one condition. They're not going to have several different experiences. They'll just have the one. An example of something like this is a study on caffeine on memory. We have three groups. People are only assigned to one group. Group one will never get any caffeine. Group two will only get 100 milligrams, and group three will only get 200. So each participant only completes one of those groups. Some of the key features of this is that it really prevents order effects. It doesn't matter the order because they're not getting multiple treatments. So it kind of like totally eliminates the problem of order effects. I'm not having to worry about carryover because they're only doing it once. I'm not having to worry about them relearning the test or any of those components or getting too fatigued because they're only doing one thing. It does require more participants. It requires a lot more participants because you have to have enough people within each group rather than using the same subject to put data in each of those groups. So always bigger studies when you're doing something like this. And it's really important to use random assignment to control for individual differences between those groups, especially important between those groups because you aren't getting the natural variance that would come if the participants were engaged in more than one of the groups. So all that to say, between subject is when a participant only experiences one group or independent variable. Here's a visual of what that looks like. So we'll take our sample, we'll break it into groups. That group only gets one treatment. This is a 2-group, but you can imagine with as many groups as you want. This is the most simple form of it, this is what we talked about last week. But between subjects is very literally everyone is assigned to one group, boom, done, over. There are a few different forms of common between subject designs. I'm presenting them this way because it's the easiest way to do it, but just so you know, they're common forms or applications, but it's often that things are more complicated than this. It's not usually a perfect 2-group design or a perfect multi-group design. It usually gets more complicated than this. But for the sake of teaching, we're going to say that these are the 3 most common forms of between subject design. We've already talked extensively last week about the 2-group design, so this is just exactly what it sounds like. Participants are randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions. Multi-group design is 3 or more. So any sort of design that has 3 or more groups is a multi-group design rather than a 2-group design. And each of those groups have only one independent variable or treatment condition. Matched group design is when participants are matched on relevant characteristics. We also talked about this last week, and then assigned to different groups. So it's not random design the way that multi-group typically is. It's a matched group so that you can balance out meaningful characteristics between groups. So you make sure that you're still accounting for that. This is very often things like age and baseline ability. So if I am testing people on the cognitive, or on, let's use this example, pairs of participants matched on baseline memory are split into treatment versus control group. If I'm testing something based on memory, just because my example here is about caffeine, and I give everyone who agreed to be a participant a baseline measure of cognitive ability, and then I split them into 3 groups, I'm going to make sure that each of those 3 groups have some people who scored more low on memory, some people who scored more medium, and some people who scored more high in each of those 3 groups, so that each of the groups have a natural bell curve. It helps spread out some of those differences in a way that you'll actually see in a real human population. So match group can be really helpful if you know that there are meaningful character differences between participants that you want to try to control for. Yeah, okay. That's between subject. Between subject. Big takeaway here is between subject is when a participant is only assigned to one condition. That's in contrast to our within subject design. Within subject design is an experimental design when participants experience all levels of the independent variable. That means the same participant is going to be measured multiple times in multiple conditions. This is very commonly used when comparing conditions within the same individual is feasible and desirable for that particular research question. So it will also help reduce variability because of individual differences. So these are also called several things. It's in our text, we're calling them within subject design. It is also very commonly referred to as within group design, also dependent design, also repeated measures design. I'll talk about some of the nuance of that. Research is fun, isn't it? Lots of synonyms for things, but they have slight differences. So an example here, building on our caffeine, is within subject design, each participant will consume all 3 levels of caffeine in different sessions. So we're not going to have them start with none, and then do 100 and then do 200 all in the same day. Because remember, carryover effects will probably have them come back on different days, but each individual participant will experience all 3 levels of that caffeine. After each dose, the participant will have that same memory task. So the order of caffeine conditions, because we're trying to control for some of these validity threats, we might randomize the order of caffeine conditions that people are experiencing. So if we have people in the design, maybe some of them will start with 200 milligrams and the next day they'll do 0 and the next day they'll do 100. Some people will do 0 one day and then 100 the next day and then 200. We'll flip it up so that not everyone is getting the exact same treatment order, but they are getting the exact same treatment we talked about earlier. Try to control for some of those threats to validity. So let's see, key features is we like within subject design because it reduces error from individual differences, which increases your statistical power. Another way to say that is because it's the exact same participant who's getting all of the conditions, we know that everything else is as constant as possible. Whereas if I'm asking different people to be in each of the groups, there's going to be such meaningful differences between those individual people that we can't as accurately account for them. What we also like about within subject design is that it requires fewer participants because I can get data in all of my different treatment groups without having to have totally different people in each of those treatment groups. And each person can serve as their own control. So rather than me comparing memory to a bunch of people I randomly assigned to a group to get no caffeine, and then comparing that to a bunch of other randomly assigned people at 100, I'm looking at the same person at 0 versus 100. So I know that individual person's baseline. So it's just a stronger, more exact way to measure something like that. It is particularly vulnerable to order effects, though, whereas between subjects, we really don't have to worry about order effects. Within subject design, you do have to worry about order effects. So what we just talked about, those practice, fatigue, carryover, and they need to be controlled through counterbalancing.
What is the difference between a between sub?
Let's see how long this is. It's a really good video. For the sake of time, I'm not going to watch it on this, but as you study and as you think through some of your own pieces, it can be really helpful to hear different people explain this. So love that video, highly recommend. We're not going to watch it today. So here's a visual of what within subject design might look like, just as a comparison from between subject. In this case, our entire sample gets each of the treatments. Rather than dividing them into treatment A and treatment B, all of them are going to get treatment A and treatment B. Some of them might get treatment A first, some of them might get treatment B first. That's part of where we're counterbalancing. But for simplicity, I just like this visual so you can kind of see the difference as compared to between subject. Common forms of within subject design. So again, these aren't specifically like types within the strict methodological sense, but for realistic application, these are the most common forms within subject designs. So our first one, and this is a very, 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 very popular technique within psychology, is called pre-post test design. And this is where we're measuring the participants before and then again after that intervention. So if I want to say that my manipulated variable, my intervention, is what made the effect, I have to know what was happening before the effect. So pre and post test. This is really helpful in detecting changes over time. And it is the easiest form of longitudinal research, meaning I'm looking at things at multiple time points, because you can do it in a shorter length of time. So this example is participants rate anxiety levels before and after mindfulness training. I can do that all in a day. I have them in the morning do some sort of anxiety level testing. That's our pre. And then we have the mindfulness training, and then we have them do it again, and that's our post, right? Pre-post. But if I only measured it after the mindfulness training, I don't have anything to compare it to. So I can't actually see a change. So it doesn't really mean anything unless I also have a comparison group, but then it's like, okay, are the comparison groups, are the characteristics similar enough to make sure that we can accurately say that this is a thing that's changing, yada, yada, yada. That's why for any sort of pre-post test, it is a within subject design most of the time. Well, I mean, by nature, it's a within subject. And so I really like it in psychology because people are so different that it's often easier to compare them against themselves rather than other people. Repeated measures design is when a participant experiences multiple levels of the IV, and it's a very core form of within subject design. So each participant is going to experience a task under low, medium, and high stress conditions. So we have each participant's experience multiple levels. It's almost all within subject is also a repeated measures design. There's some nuance to that, but on the whole, that is usually what is going on. And then we have a longitudinal design. So this is a special case of repeated measures across long time intervals. So using to track development or behavioral changes. So an example here is maybe we're testing the attention span of the same child when they're 6, when they're 8, and when they're 10. The only way to really meaningfully track changes is to do it with the same participant across times in their life. Part of what gets tricky and part of why I have this little like designator at the top saying these aren't like strictly methodologically different things. Oftentimes you will have, like even the example of longitudinal, it's usually a longitudinal repeated measures design, which might also include a pre-post test. So these things aren't uniquely different things. They sometimes overlap, but these are the 3 major categories of them. And then we have something called a mixed experimental design. It is exactly what it sounds like. It's when we're using both within subject and between subjects for testing our independent variables. This is when participants experience multiple conditions, but not all of them are experienced for all participants. So let's say this example is we're looking at a study on gender in caffeine dose effective memory. So the between subject part of it is we're comparing groups of people against each other rather than against themselves. Maybe we're looking at men versus women. But within that, we're using the same participants testing at each different level of caffeine. So we're doing a little bit of both. We are both comparing different groups and we're having some of those participants engage in multiple levels of the independent variable or treatment because we're looking at both between and within differences. This is honestly usually where most people land with their research. It depends. Funding matters, logistics matters, depends on the research question. That's the hard part of research design is, and I hear it as I teach it, it depends, it depends, it depends. I'm trying to teach you what it depends on. So let's see. This is most commonly used when comparing conditions across different groups and within individuals. So a lot of y'all's research designs are going to fall within this mixed experimental design. The key feature is that you get both the strengths of both types. So you get efficiency and you get a higher level of control. And it allows for testing interactions in between participant characteristics and experimental manipulations that you just don't get from either purely between or purely within. When you combine them, you get both of the strengths, but you also get both of the weaknesses of those designs. So, like everything, pros and cons. So, for a mixed experimental design, you still have to plan for stuff like counterbalancing and group assignment, even though you wouldn't have to if it was just a between subject IV. So, it's additive. It's both. It's literally all it is. That being said, that's a whole lot of information very quickly, so I love a graph. So here are some common applications for experimental designs. Again, these are not mutually exclusive types. It's just the easiest way to teach it. Very often you're combining different types. It depends on the research question. But we have each of our major design formats, so pretest, post-test, repeated measures, multi-group, longitudinal, matching groups, common applications for why you might use this, and what type of major design those things are used within. So if you're using a repeated measures design format, it will always be within subjects. It might also be mixed, but at the very least, if you're using repeated measures, it is within subjects. So I like this because it's helpful as you think through what your design is and not just the format, but also like the major experimental design type. All right, all of it is building. I know you guys are so excited to talk about statistics, but it's building the statistics. We got to talk about it. So what? What does this mean in terms of research? This is not a research course, but it is required that I teach you about statistics. The way I choose to do that is I'm going to teach you some of the major components that you would think through, but we aren't gonna do the math. That's just not what we're doing. That's not this class. I can't do it all well, and I don't want to surprise you with some statistics. So here we go. In the last lesson, we talked about how the very first thing you're going to do in statistical testing when you're comparing between groups is test for normality. So as a recap, we talked about what normality assumptions are, that we want to have a normal bell curve, and we use tools like the Shapiro-Wilk, the QQ plot, and Levin's test. That should have another whatever. I also, this is, I hope, a refresher from a stats class you have taken either now or at a different point of your academic career. But as a friendly reminder, you have hypotheses within tests and within research. We almost always talk about the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. These are usually just designated as this H with the little mini o or this H with the little mini 1. The null hypothesis, so H0, means that there is no effect and no difference and no relationship between our independent and dependent variable. So an example of this might mean that caffeine has no effect on memory. So my hypothesis is that there is no relationship between these variables. An alternative hypothesis is that there is an effect between these variables. Now, there can be lots of different alternatives. If you think these are positively related to each other, meaning that as one goes up, the other goes up, whether these are negatively related to each other, meaning when one goes down, the other goes down, whether these are inverse related to each other, meaning when one goes down, the other goes up, all of those are happy possibilities, but all of them are types of alternative hypothesis. So at core, null hypothesis means there's no relationship between these variables. An alternative hypothesis means there is a relationship between these variables. Hypotheses are helpful to think through as you think through some of the errors that can happen statistically. There are two types of statistical errors that we talk about a lot within this field. One is called type 1 error, and this is when we have a false positive. This is when we reject the null hypothesis, even though it's actually true. Another way to say that is we falsely believe that the alternative hypothesis that there is an effect is real, but actually that's not true. So in this example, you conclude that caffeine improves memory. You conclude that the alternative hypothesis is correct, but it actually isn't. So that's a type 1 error. It's a false positive. Type 2 error is the opposite. It's when we have a false negative. This is when you reject the null hypothesis when it is actually false. So you conclude caffeine has no effect, but it actually does. So in this example, we think that the null hypothesis is accurate when that's not true, right? So I also love a little graphic, as you know. So when the null hypothesis is true and you reject it, you have a type 1 error. When the null hypothesis is false and you accept it or fail to reject, then we have a type 2 error. That's a lot. And I'm dyslexic, and so I hate this type of conversation, which is why I love a graphic. So as you think through some of this, I recommend you check out these slides. I also really like this Khan Academy video that covers the same content. So as you are studying, as you are thinking through your own design, here's one I recommend.
Well,
all right. So some key concepts in hypothesis testing, the big statistics that we end up talking about, like the so what, the meat of the statistics, because again, we're not going to run through how you actually perform them, but I do want you to know the key concepts within hypothesis testing. So our first one is alpha. It is usually designated with this little alpha A looking sign. This is called significance. Significance level is how confident we are that we're avoiding type 1 error. So in behavioral sciences, we usually set that at 0.05. 0.05 means that we are 95% sure, or 0.05%, we could be wrong. We are 95% sure that the relationship between these variables is statistically significant. It's a high standard. We want our p-value to be smaller than 0.05 when possible, because if it's a 0.01, it means there's 1% chance that we're incorrect. 0.05 is standard for behavioral sciences. There's different types of sciences that have different p-values that are considered best practice. So for medical research, it's usually like 0.01 or 0.03. For behavioral sciences, it's usually set at 0.05 because we know that when you're studying something like psychology, there is always going to be a risk of type 1 error. There just is, because people are so different and people's environments are so different. There's always going to be some risk of it. But 0.05 is, let me tell you, a pretty high standard, and you're always praying for that as you run your statistics is, oh, yeah, 0.05, that 0.05. We want it to be smaller than 0.05 so that we can reject that null hypothesis, meaning that we know there is actually an effect. All right, our beta, which kind of looks like this little B sign, it's almost always shown as this sign. It doesn't usually say beta, it's usually just that mathematical designation. This is the probability of failing to detect a true effect. So this is occurring when you fail to reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis is actually false. The smaller your beta, the more likely it is you're catching real effects. So it's usually not, like as the researcher, you usually don't set the beta. It's usually done through different types of power analyses, which is why you have to have a certain sample size to do different statistics. It's a little out of realm for what we're looking for in this course, so I won't make you know anything more than what's on this slide. But I want you to know that alpha is significance level, and I want you to know that beta is probability of failing to detect the true effect. So you want a low beta. So, and then we have statistical power. It's the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when it's false. In other words, we're detecting a real effect when it exists. So a standard goal is an 80% statistical power beta, so 0.2, because that's 80%. 0.2 means you're 80% sure that this is correct. And the higher that power, the lower the chance of type 2 errors. So sample size is very important, effect size is very important, alpha level is very important. And our big takeaway here is that a well-designed study is going to balance a low alpha, so we're controlling for type 1, with a high power, so we are trying to control for type 2. Underpowered studies risk missing real fundings, so participant size matters. Usually, for most statistics we're comparing between groups, the very, 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 very minimum is 30 people or 30 data points per control group that you're looking at, but it depends. And the more people, the more data you have, the more confident you can be in your conclusions. Okay, so what does that mean about how I choose a type of statistic for my specific research design, for my specific, question, whatever it is? So there's a few different steps, right? The first thing I'm going to think about when we're deciding what statistical approach to use when we're comparing between groups is one, the number of groups. If you have 2 groups, it's a totally different type of statistics than if you have 3 or more groups. Really important. We're also thinking about the type of design. Are we using between subjects or are we using within subjects? It's going to really change the difference in what statistical approach will be best. And then we're also going to test for that normality, those normality assumptions. If there is a normal distribution of data, which we talked about last week, then there's a certain set of parametric tests you can use. These are more statistically powerful, but it requires that your data is normally distributed. We also have a set of non-parametric tests, which is when those assumptions of normality are not met or not met adequately. So you're not totally out of luck if your data isn't normally distributed. It just means you have to use non-parametric statistical testing, which has fewer normality assumptions so that you can have more robust conclusions, but it's not always suitable for all types of data. Trying not to get into my statistics mode, but the short of it is we have parametric testing when your data is normally distributed. We have non-parametric testing when your data is not normally distributed. So those are the three big things we're thinking about. How many groups do I have? What type of design? And are my normality assumptions met? So then, and here's the money, honestly. This is as deep as I'm going to go into it. Here's a nice little graphic to help you decide, right? So I struggled with how to best put this together. So I'm going to try to explain what we're doing here. So our very first step is, okay, am I using parametric? Am I using non-parametric? I'm using parametric when my data is normally distributed. I'm using non-parametric when my data is not normally distributed. For the sake of this class and your research proposal project, we're going to assume that everything goes wonderfully. So you're going to use a parametric test. You don't need to even worry about non-parametric testing. I just want you to know those exist, and I'll have some questions on some quizzes about what those non-parametric testings are and when you might use them. But for your purposes, for your project, let's just stick to parametric testing. Next thing I do is say, okay, so parametric tests, because that's what we're doing for the class. What type of group did I use? What design did I use? Did I use 2 groups or did I use 3 or more groups? If I use 2 groups, I know that if I'm a between subject 2 grouper, I'm going to use independent sample t-testing. That's your statistical analysis. You'll use independent sample t-test. That's where we're just comparing between 2 groups that are between subjects. If you have 2 groups or 2 conditions, and you're using a within subject design, then we're going to use something called a paired samples t-test. So different type of t-test. Because this is not a statistics class, I'm not going to go deeper into what that means, but I want you to be able to differentiate as if you are really a researcher, how would I decide what stats I would run? If we're using more than 3 groups, if it's a between subject design, we'll use a one-way ANOVA. And if it's a within subject design with 3 or more groups, we're going to use a repeated measures ANOVA. These are some of the advantages of those parametric tests and disadvantages compared to the non-parametric advantages and disadvantages. So hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this ties some things together. I am not going to hold you accountable for knowing what an ANOVA is or what a t-test is at any higher level, other than I want you to know when you would use it. It's a different class that's going to teach you how to run those statistics, but my job is to teach you how to conclude what statistics you would be using in the first place. So hopefully this is helpful. This is a dense section though, and I acknowledge that. I highly recommend that you pull up the slides as you are engaging in your activity for the week, as you are designing your own research. Most of you will be using something within this multi-group design lecture today. So think through it, think through the 2 group versus 3 group, and then the between and within. And after that, it gets easier to pick and choose what's going to make the most sense for your research question. But per usual, y'all reach out when you have questions, and I will see y'all next time.